But first, as I promised last night, let's return to Victoria's hotel quarantine calamity, especially in light of all the new material released late yesterday. And as I said in my column on Sunday, how is it that we're determined to get to the bottom of 39 deaths that our soldiers may be responsible for in Afghanistan, yet we're supposed to accept there's nothing to see here when 800 Victorians die and those deaths are scientifically linked to the government's incompetent oversight of hotel quarantine. Now, for the soldiers, there's likely criminal prosecution. But for the politicians, it looks like everyone's getting off scot-free. And those that resign, well, of course, they still get their payouts, their pensions, and everything else they've managed to negotiate on the way out the door. It's an appalling double standard, and it stinks. Think about this. At 1 o'clock on March 27, Friday, March 27, the National Cabinet makes the decision that all travellers returning to Australia will go into hotel quarantine supervised by the police and the military. And at 3:15, so 2 and a bit hours later, on that same day, Victorian Premier announces that private security will be involved in the supervision. But inexplicably, the Premier says on oath, and now in 2 affidavits, that he doesn't know how that happened or who changed the National Cabinet decision in Victoria. It just doesn't stack up. It doesn't stack up. I've worked for a head of government, I've worked for cabinet ministers. I've never known a senior politician to announce something that he or she is not sure of, especially something that's materially different from an early unanimous decision that they were privy to. A few things stand out from the massive material that the Coate Inquiry released late on Friday. Too late for the weekend's papers to do it much in terms of justice. And then material released again yesterday. Again, too late for much of the media to assess it last night. There's the Premier's continued insistence, like Sergeant Schultz, that he knew nothing about the decision he announced in a press conference at Day back in March. This from a notorious control freak of a Premier because he says, quote, operational matters are supposedly below his pay grade. Even though Daniel Andrews is constantly all over operational detail, such as text messages between his staff, they highlight how operational he is. And of course, even this recent tweet about masks at Bunnings. They all show this is a very hands-on Premier. Then there's the Chief Health Officer's admission of an apparent inconsistency between the information we know now that he'd repeatedly been given about private security from that very first day and Sutton's insistence under oath that he knew nothing about private security in these quarantine hotels until May. And then there's the fact that on leaving the National Cabinet meeting to get the ball rolling, the then Premier's department head doesn't phone the head of the Health Department or the head of the Justice Department, which is what you'd expect if it was to implement the National Cabinet decision to use police and military in hotel quarantine. Now, when he leaves, this is Chris Eccles, he's now resigned. Well, Chris Eccles phones the head of the Jobs Department. Again, ask yourself this. Why would he call the department dealing with private security and not the department dealing with the police if the decision to use private security hadn't already been cooked up while the National Cabinet meeting was going on between him and the Premier? Why did the Premier's Chief of Staff herself call a number of ministers, a fact previously not disclosed, but which we know about now, of course, from these newly released phone records in the past couple of days? If you look carefully at the detail of the Chief of Staff's phone records, you will see one call in particular that's worth your attention. The call from the Premier's Chief of Staff to now former Health Minister, Jenny Mikakos. Look at the time of the call. It's 12:38 p.m, before the National Cabinet meeting had even broken up. But of course, she knew what the Premier's instructions were because when Chris Eccles leaves the room to deliver them around 12 noon, as we know, the first person he spoke to was the Chief of Staff, who was sitting outside the door of the National Cabinet. Now, the call between the Chief of Staff and Eccles went on for about 6 minutes. What did they discuss? Well, the Premier said in his affidavit he doesn't know, and presumably he hasn't even bothered to ask her. We can't ask Jenny Eccles because Counsel Assisting never followed this up in their questioning, and they have declined to recall Eccles and ask her, even though she's publicly argued that she needs to be put back in the witness stand, and the Premier too, and cross-examined. We can't ask the Chief of Staff, as we know, because she's never once appeared in the witness stand in the Coate Inquiry. You could not make this stuff up. This has been covered over more than anything else I've ever seen in Australian political history. And by far the most powerful of the new submissions was the latest missive from Victoria Police dated November 24. Now, this submission states that Counsel Assisting's view, no decision to use private security was ever made, that it was all a creeping assumption, or as now amended, a starting assumption. Well, Victoria Police say that is simply wrong based on the factual evidence. The Victoria Police submission states that there was an actual decision, that private security would be used, and that this decision had been made prior to the end of the National Cabinet meeting. Accords, doesn't it? When Eccles leaves the room before the end, he speaks to the Chief of Staff before the end, she calls the Health Minister, all before the end. Well, that's Victoria Police's view too. And the fact that a decision has been made is corroborated, Victoria Police say, by the following. First, by the fact that the first call made out of the National Cabinet was not to the Justice Department or the policing area, but to the Jobs Department. Second, by a National Cabinet outcomes email that was circulated at 2:48 p.m. on that fateful Friday that stated, quote, to be based on a verbal debrief from the Premier's Department, stating that, quote again, government's keen for police not to be babysitting, but called as needed, for example, using private security. And third, to the reference to private security in the Premier's own press conference. Here he is again, in his own words, just 2 hours after National Cabinet, introducing the use of private security in Victoria's COVID hotels. This is the moment where Victoria goes it alone.
But we have sufficient capacity and we've done the work early to be able to accommodate those people. They will be housed, they will be fed, they will be transported. There'll be no cost to them. But this is the best way to ensure absolute compliance. Police, private security, all of our health team will be able to monitor compliance in a much easier way, in a static location, one hotel or a series of hotels, as the case may be.
Doesn't know where that decision came from, can't remember who told him, even though it differed from a decision that was unanimous of the National Cabinet only 2 hours earlier. Now, this final and latest submission for Victoria Police is quite unequivocal. The Board of Inquiry's findings should be that, and I quote, in the 1:17 p.m. phone call, Mr Eccles, the Premier's departmental head, told Police Commissioner Graham Ashton that private security would be used. That's the police view. And such a finding, Victoria Police say, is supported by their, quote again, contemporaneous documentary evidence that's superior to subsequent and possibly self-serving memories. Now, Victoria Police also slam Counsel Assisting submission for shying away from the plain and only available finding, which is that Mr Eccles conveyed the information that private security would be used to Commissioner Ashton. Now ask yourself this final question. If it was the Premier's departmental head who told the Police Commissioner that private security would be used, after spending a couple of hours huddled in National Cabinet with only the Premier as company, who would have made that decision, do you think? The public servant freelancing outside a unanimous National Cabinet decision, or the Premier? Now, you only have to ask it to answer it, don't you? And here's what's really bizarre. Despite all this new material about things suddenly remembered and reluctantly revealed, the Coate Inquiry has still decided not to reopen hearings or to subject to cross-examination all the normally powerful people who knew nothing about such a critical decision that no one had apparently ever made in order to unpack their incredibly selective memories. Maybe Jennifer Coate already knows enough to hold the government collectively guilty and to recommend the Premier take responsibility and resign. More likely, I fear, she would rather not subject Victorian officials to the humiliation of again struggling to justify what they plainly did or should have known, that the decision must ultimately have been the Premier's. And Coate's definitely not calling witnesses like Makakos or the Premier's Chief of Staff involved in a critical call before the meeting had even broken up, lest one of them might actually start telling the truth. Now, it's patently clear that Daniel Andrews wants Victorians to move on and to ignore his government's monumental failures that have led to what is the worst disaster in modern Australian policy history. When the Coate report finally emerges just before Christmas, Andrews wants to be able to say it's all sorted. That's why he announced yesterday splitting the Department of Health and Human Services into its two broad constituent parts: health on the one hand, and on the other, the Orwellian Department of Families, Fairness and Housing. That's why he announced a new hotel quarantine program with a clearer chain of command, and this time with police involved, but not absolutely exclusively involved, in the provision of security services. But as for the 800 dead, well, as far as the Premier's concerned, he wants us all to believe we need to learn from this, but not apportion blame. Well, I know where most Australians sit on this. If we have to pin down who's to blame for 39 foreign dead in Afghanistan, it's just or even more important to pin down who's to blame for the decision which ultimately saw 800 dead of our own here at home. And plainly, Mr. Premier, even Victoria Police, think that's you.